بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. وتتفاوت رتبه أي الصحيح بسبب تفاوت هذه الأوصاف المقتضية للتصحيح في القوة، فإنها لما كانت مفيدة لغلبة الظن الذي عليه مدار الصحة اقتضت أن يكون لها درجات بعضها فوق بعض بحسب الأمور المقوية، وإذا كان كذلك فما تكون رواته في الدرجة العليا من العدالة والضبط وسائر الصفات التي توجب الترجيح كان أصح مما دونه. فمن الرتبة العليا في ذلك ما أطلق عليه بعض الأئمة أنه أصح الأسانيد، كالزهري عن سالم بن عبد الله بن عمر عن أبيه، وكمحمد بن سيرين عن أبيدة بن عمرو عن علي، وكإبراهيم النخعي عن علقمة عن ابن مسعود رضي الله عنهم. After defining Sahih لذاته, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he now speaks about what is known as Asahul Asanid. So Asahul Asanid means the most authentic of all chains. It's obvious that narrators would differ in their reliability and in their memory, in their retentive skills. So therefore it naturally follows that all Sahih narrations cannot be of the same status. Some narrations would be more authentic than other narrations. Now, scholars of the past, they looked at this here, they took note of the caliber of narrators in each link, and then they graded certain chains as Asahul Asanid, as the most authentic of all chains. However, there are lots and lots of differences. Many scholars presented different views on what is regarded as Asahul Asanid. But nevertheless, you have these narrations that are graded as Asahul Asanid. Then you have narrations which are authentic, but no one ever graded them as Asahul Asanid. So now, can the two be the same? Can a narration which a great scholar of the past like Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, if he said it's Asahul Asanid, can that be the same as a narration which no scholar has ever mentioned that it is Asahul Asanid? No, they cannot be the same. So although both are authentic, within this group of authentic narrations you are going to have different levels. The narrations are not going to be of the same caliber. So Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, in this paragraph here, he speaks and he explains these different levels of authentic chains. So what he does is he groups all those narrations which scholars have mentioned that they are Asahul Asanid. Like I said, there are so many different views. So he takes all of those and he put them of the highest caliber, of the highest level. And he then gives 3 examples. Thereafter, he brings a category for narrations that are authentic, but they are not on the status of those. Why? Because no one has ever mentioned that they are Asahul Asanid. And again, he gives examples for those. And then he brings a category for narrations that just made it to be Sahih. So that are on the lowest level of Sahih narrations. In fact, some scholars would even consider those narrations as Hasan. So those form part of the lowest level. And then he concludes this chapter by mentioning that we cannot claim with absolute certainty that one particular chain is Asahul Asanid, is the most authentic. So this is the brief overview of the next 2 pages. Let us go through the text. He says, وَتَتَفَاوَتُ رُتَبُهُ, that the ranks, the levels of Sahih narrations would differ. And why would they differ? بسبب تفاوت هذه الأوصاف المقتضية للتصحيح في القوة. That we mentioned the conditions for a Sahih narration. That the narrator has to be adal, he has to have tam al-dabt. So he's saying that these conditions, they vary. So because they differ, so therefore ultimately the status of Sahih narrations will also vary and differ. And this is logical, because if you have a great Hafiz and he is narrating from an Imam who in turn is narrating from someone who was known as Amirul Mu'minin fil Hadith, then that narration is definitely going to be more authentic than a narration that was narrated by someone who was thiqa, so he was reliable, he had a good memory, and he is also narrating from someone who was also just reliable and had a good memory, but he was not outstanding. And that person is also narrating from someone like this here who was average. The first sanad will definitely get preference and will be stronger than this chain here. So to put it in our context to make it easy for you to understand, say you have a narration and it's the first narrator is a PhD professor. He is narrating from someone who is teaching for many years. He in turn is quoting someone who is known to be a genius. Then you have another chain, and this here it's a person who just graduated recently. He is transmitting from someone who is in his second year of university studies, and he in turn is narrating from someone who just completed his high school. So can the two chains be the same? No, they cannot be the same. Even though you could trust both chains, what is transmitted via both chains. That this person, this chain where you have the students, they will be telling you something that's the truth. And that which is transmitted by very highly qualified and educated scholars, they will tell you something and you can also trust them. But the two chains are not the same. So in the same way, Sahih narrations are not all going to be of the same status. There will have to be different levels within this broad category of Sahih narrations. And that is what Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah is mentioning here. فإنها لما كانت مفيدة لغلبة الظن الذي عليه مدار الصحة اقتضت أن يكون لها درجات. He says since Sahih narrations gives you غلبة الظن. And Ghalabatul Dhan, it's this year on what soundness is based. He says, اقتضت أن يكون لها درجات. It's necessary that there will be different ranks. Now here he mentions Ghalabatul Dhan. When he was conducting the lessons, then he told the students, الغلبة ليست بقيد وإنما أردت دفع توهم إرادة الشك لو عبرت بالظن. He's saying that I use the word غلبة الظن in the text. However, this here is not a قيد احترازي. It's not an intended clause. The only reason I mentioned it, that the sentence would have been correct even if I didn't put it. I could have said فإنها لما كانت مفيدة للظن, without putting the word غلبة. But وإنما أردت دفع توهم إرادة الشك. That if I would have put the word then alone, then the reader, he could have understood that you will only get doubt from an authentic narration. So therefore I mentioned the word غلبة. Here again, you remember Alama Qasim ibn Qutlubgha rahimahullah, he was not pleased with Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah placing the condition of tam al-dabt. So he again raises that point here, and he says that if tam refers to complete precision, the best of memories, then how can there be different levels? That once every narrator reaches that ultimate limit, then they all ought to be on par with each other. And if they don't reach that limit, then they are not fulfilling the condition of Sahih. So therefore, every person who reaches the level of Sahih, every person who fulfills the condition of Sahih, he will reach that limit, and therefore they all ought to be on par with one another. So he's saying, لا أعلم بعد التمام رتبة. That if you're saying they must be tam, then after tam, how can you have any additional level? ودون التمام لم توجد الحد. And if you are saying that they are less than tam al-dabt, then they are not fulfilling the condition of Sahih. So therefore the narration will not even be Sahih. فيطلب تصوير هذه الأوصاف وكيف تتفاوت. So he was not happy that you are putting, that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah used the word tam al-dabt. It is saying that you should have just said al-dabt. That as long as the person has al-dabt, the narration will be considered as authentic. There was no reason, there was no need for him to add the word tam. But nevertheless, when looking at the amount of mistakes that a narrator made, then you can get an idea and you can work out how strong his memory was. So he says بعضها فوق بعض بحسب الأمور المقوية, that some of them are higher than others. Why? Based on methods which will strengthen one another. So, for example, if you have very authentic and very, very prominent narrators in one link, then that is al-umur al-muqawiyah. That is from those strengthening methods. So he says, وَإِذَا كَانَ كَذَلِكَ, when the matter is like this, yeah, فَمَا تَكُونُ رُوَاتُهُ فِي الدَّرَجَةِ الْعُلْيَا, when you have narrators who are of the highest caliber, من العدالة والضبط, in terms of fitness and retention, وسائر الصفات التي توجب الترجيح, كان أصح مما دونه, then these will definitely be more authentic than a narration which does not have narrators who fulfill to that level, who fulfill these conditions to that level. So because they are of all different levels, so Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah now categorizes the authentic narrations. And he commences with the highest level, and he says, فَمِنَ الرُّتْبَةِ الْعُلْيَا فِي ذَلِكَ مَا أَطْلَقَ عَلَيْهِ بَعْضُ الْأَئِمَّةِ أَنَّهُ أَصَحُّ الْأَسَانِيدِ. That the highest level is that where Imams have said that it is Asahul Asanid. Now here, before going through these categories, I want to mention a few points. So the first point is, like I mentioned in the beginning, there are lots and lots of different views. If you have to go through Al-Kifaya of Alama Khatib rahimullah, or if you go through Ma'arifa Ulum al-Hadith of Imam Hakim, you will see there are so many differences on which is Asahul Asanid. In fact, at times from one scholar, there are different views which are mentioned. From these examples, I'll show you how from one scholar there are different views. So that's the first point to make note of. The second point to make note of here is Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he mentioned the word Asahul Asanid. He did not say Asahul Ahadith. So if a narration was transmitted via Asahul Asanid, then that does not necessarily mean that the hadith, the matn at the end, will be the most authentic of mutun. Does not necessarily mean that this will be the most authentic narration. So the reason is because even if a narration is transmitted by such great scholars, the narration could be shaz, isn't it? Or it could be mu'allal. We spoke previously of how the greatest of imams could make mistakes. So you might have a great imam who is quoting from a great imam in this chain, and he's quoting the narration in a particular way. But then you have a group of narrators in the parallel chain, and they are all quoting something in contrast to him. So this here is the reality. When we go through the books of Ḥadīth, we find many examples like this here. It's not something that is just hypothetical. You know, in the durus of Muwatta, we highlight narrations like this. In the very first narration of the Muwatta, the wordings of the colleagues of Imam Malik rahimahullah are preferred over his. And yet he was greater than all of them. And it's not us who are giving preference. Alama ibn Abdul Barr rahimahullah, who was an ardent supporter of Imam Malik rahimahullah, and he was a great follower of the Maliki madhab. He is the one who is saying that we will prefer the wordings of how those narrators have transmitted it over what Imam Malik rahimahullah has transmitted. Likewise, those of you who are studying Muqaddama ibn Salah, you know how many examples we give of narrations where you have imams and they are being contradicted by those who are of lower status than them, and we are giving preference to those narrations. So that's the second point, that Asahul Asanid does not equal to Asahul Ahadith. The third point is that these scholars, when they mention their views and their suggestions, and they claim that one narration is Asahul Asanid, then they mentioned it at a time when there were only 3 or 4 links between them and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So you'll see from these examples here that there are only 3 links. But when the authors of the Sihah Sitta came, then there were 2 or 3 additional links. So you have Imam Tirmidhi rahimahullah, for example, he is quoting from his teacher, who in turn is quoting from another narrator, and then he is quoting from the first person of Asahul Asanid. Now, when you have these additional narrators, then these additional narrators are not necessarily of the same caliber as those above them. So therefore, we cannot now say that this here is asahul asanid. Even though half the chain composes of asahul asanid, the fact remains that it's not the full chain which has been graded as asahul asanid. So this here is an important point to keep in mind when you do the siha sitta. So that was the third point. Then the fourth point is that adala and dabd, these are things which cannot be quantified or measured. Can you measure how trustworthy a person was? Or can you measure how precise a person was, how good his memory was? So because you cannot measure these things, it makes it very difficult to have absolute surety and become completely convinced that a particular person is the most reliable. And also realize that this year was at a time when the world was filled with scholars who fulfill all of these conditions to the highest level. So it means that the competition, if you want to phrase it with that word, the competition was great, that there were numerous giants and experts at that time. So to now choose this one over that one, it becomes very, very difficult. And because adala and dabt cannot be measured and it cannot be quantified, so we cannot have absolute certainty. There is no way that we can be absolutely sure that this definitely will be asahul asanid. And this then also led to so many differences. Because assuming we have 40 scholars who only made a mistake or two, now how will we give preference? How are we going to know now which chain is going to be the most authentic? And then remember that there was no maximum limit of narrations that every narrator could have narrated. And there is no precise and exact amount of narrations that each and every scholar narrated. Like, for example, if the limit was 5,000 narrations, then we could have evaluated the reports of each and every person who narrated 5,000 and 5,000 narrations. And in that way, we could have judged and graded them equally. But the amount of narrations that every narrator narrates, it differs so much. There are so many different numbers. It all differs drastically. So that means that this competition is not fair. That if one narrator transmits 2,000 narrations and he makes 5 mistakes, but another narrator, he only narrates 50 narrations and he makes only 1 mistake, then how can we compare? We can't compare. Then the scholars who were grading, let's refer to them as judges, they did not know each and every narration that each and every narrator transmitted. So can you see how difficult it becomes to judge? And that is why also mostly scholars passed comments on those whose narrations they were exposed to. Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he mentions in his Nukat, وتوضيح هذا أن كثيرا ممن نقل عنه الكلام في ذلك إنما يرجح إسناد أهل بلده وذلك لشدة اعتنائه. He's saying that most of those whose statements we are quoting and we are transmitting, that they have graded a particular chain as asahul asanid, they were actually grading the asanid of their locality. They gave preference to the chain of their locality. Why? Because they were exposed to this chain and they knew about these narrators very well. Now here he uses the word kathir, which shows that this was how most of the scholars commented. It does not mean all the scholars. He didn't use the word jami'. So from the very first example that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah presents here in the text, you will see that scholars also graded narrations from other areas if they were aware that the scholars of those areas were deserving of this title of asahul asanid. So the scholars were not biased, na'udhu billah. The point is that it's understandable that every scholar will have a different view and a different preference. Then the next point is that just as the narrators were human beings and they could make mistakes, the scholars who were grading, they were also human beings and they could also make errors. So ultimately, irrespective of how great the scholar was who was grading, he was not alimul ghayb, isn't it? And you know, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ. So the scholar is going to grade according to what was told to him, what he was informed, what he was exposed to, what he learned. To put this in our context, if you have to go to Egypt, for example, and you ask the people there who is the greatest scholar, then they will probably tell you about a scholar of that region. So even though they might be a hafiz of hadith, a person who knows tens of thousands of hadith in the deserts of Mauritania, because this person in Egypt is not exposed to that great hafiz of hadith, he will not know. And bear in mind that all this was at a time when there was no internet and means of communication like how there is today. So therefore, every scholar is going to mention according to what he knows. Like if I have to ask you, who do you think is the most who do you think is the greatest scholar that is alive today? Then what will you answer? How will you respond? So you will base it on the scholars who you know. Probably it could be that you will take a scholar's name, but that scholar's teacher is still alive, but is hidden away in some Darul Ulum. So you will not know that you are taking the name of the student, but that student whose name you are taking, he himself will acknowledge that he is nothing in front of that teacher who is low profile in the Darul Ulum. He's just teaching there, people don't know about him. Then the next point is who was the greatest Sahabi? Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Likewise, if you have to go to the next link with regards to the greatest Tabi'i, there are differences of opinion, but many scholars they have said that it was Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab. Yet in these examples that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahmallah is presenting here, you will see that the name of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu does not even feature in Asahul Asanid. Likewise, Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, his name does not come in any of these chains. So this proves that it does not necessarily mean that the names that come in these chains which are described as Asahul Asanid, they are the names of the greatest scholars of that time. So those are a few points. I hope you made notes of them. After discussing those points, we can now go through the text and look at these chains that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah placed in the first category. So, like how Allama ibn Salah rahimahullah done, Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah, he also takes these examples from Imam Hakim rahimahullah and from Allama Khatib rahimahullah. So both of these scholars, they mention the different views with the asanid. So as we're going through these names also, I'll just quote one or two sentences so that you can compare them with the narrators in the next level. And then you can compare them with the narrators in the third category. So the first example that he gives, he says, كالزهري عن سالم ibn Abdullah ibn Umar عن أبيهم. Now firstly, if you look here, the way that it's typed out in the print of Sheikh Nuruddin Itr, it is correct. So it must be Salim Ibn Abdullah Ibn Umar. So there must be the word bin between Salim and Abdullah. So if you have any other print, if you have a print which has the word an, then correct it. It must be Salim ibn Abdullah. Why? There are some copies of Nuzha an-Naḍar in which it's typed out as Salim an Abdullah ibn Umar an Abihi. So what would that mean? It would mean that it's Zuhri who's narrating from Salim, who's narrating from Abdullah, who's narrating from his father who was Umar radiallahu an. However, in this example, the person quoting from the Prophet ﷺ is not Umar radiallahu an, it's the son of Umar, it's Abdullah ibn Umar. So to say that it's Umar radiallahu an, that is incorrect. Mullah Ali Qari rahimahullah, he highlighted this point. He said, وَفِي بَعْضِ النُّسَخِ عن سالم عن عبد الله وحينئذ لا حاجة إلى قوله عن أبيه بل يجب تركه. That if you have عن عبد الله, then you cannot add the words an abihi, bal yajibu tarkuhu. You're going to have to leave it out. Why? Because if you are going to add the words an abihi, then it's going to refer to Umar radiallahu anhu. Nevertheless, this view of Zuhri and Salim ibn Abdullah an abihi, it's the view of Imam Ahmad rahimahullah and Ishaq ibn Rahuya rahimahullah. They hold the view that this here is the most authentic of all chains. Imam Hakim rahimahullah, he quotes in Ma'rifa Ulum al-Ḥadīth, and Allama Khatib rahimahullah, he quotes in his Al-Kifaya on page 397 of Al-Kifaya, and on page 54 of Ma'rifa Ulum al-Hadith. They both quote with the asanid to Muhammad ibn Sulaiman al-Maydani. He said, سمعت إسحاق بن إبراهيم الحنظلي يقول أسانيد كلها الزهري عن سالم عن أبيه. So this here is regarding Ishaq ibn Rahuya. As for Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, Imam Hakim rahimahullah narrated an incident, and in that incident it comes, وقال أبو عبد الله أحمد بن حنبل أجود الأسانيد الزهري عن سالم عن أبيه. Now the point to note here in passing is that Ishaq was a Marwazi. He was from Marw, which is in Khurasan. In present day it's in Turkmenistan. And Imam Ahmad rahimahullah, he was from Baghdad. But all these scholars whose names they are taking, they were all from Medina. So that proves that scholars were not biased to the narrations of their locality, as we spoke earlier when we quoted that statement from the Nukat of Ibn Hajar rahimahullah. So if scholars knew that scholars of other localities were more deserving of having their chains being described as Asahul Asanid, then they would grade it as Asahul Asanid. Now let us take a look at the narrators, and you should memorize these asanid. You should at least know the chains which are known as Asahul Asanid, so that when you read these chains in the books of Ḥadīth, then at least you know that the first three conditions of Sihha has been fulfilled. So the first narrator is Imam Zuhri rahimahullah. Those of you who completed Sihha Sitta, you know Imam Zuhri rahimahullah very well, because his name features so much in the 6 books. So his full name is Muhammad ibn Muslim ibn Ubaidillah ibn Abdullah al-Zuhri. Imam Ali ibn al-Madini rahimahullah, he said that Imam Zuhri rahimahullah, he narrated 2,000 ahadith. And Imam Abu Dawud rahimahullah, he said that Imam Zuhri rahimahullah, he narrated 2,200 ahadith, and half of those are musnad, meaning they reach up to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now the reason why I'm mentioning to you this is because, as we are saying, that the more narrations that a person transmits, the more he is exposing himself to error. So if you just narrate one hadith and you make no mistake, then there's no kamal in that. 10 narrations and you make no mistake, it's not an outstanding feat. But yes, if you narrate 100 ahadith and then you make no mistakes, then that is something. Now here you can see Imam Zuhri rahimahullah, he exposed himself so much to error that he narrated 2,000 ahadith. Yet his mistakes are like a drop in the ocean, and that is how scholars realize that this person is definitely a hafiz, he's an imam. Imam Layth ibn Sa'ad rahimahullah, he said, and you also look at the caliber of the person who is saying this. It's Imam Layth rahimahullah. He was a mujtahid himself. So to impress him, to get praises from him, a person would have to be a genius. Yet he said, ما رأيت عالما قط أجمع علما من ابن شهاب. I haven't seen anyone who has more knowledge than Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri. ولو سمعت ابن شهاب يحدث بحديث في الترغيب لقلت لا يحسن إلا هذا. Had you heard him quoting a hadith on fadail and to give encouragement, you will say that this is his field of expertise. Maybe he doesn't know anything else. He dedicated all his time to this. وإن حدث عن الأنبياء وأهل الكتاب قلت لا يحسن إلا هذا. But if you have to hear him quoting a hadith about the Anbiya and the Ahlul Kitab, then you will say no, maybe he's dedicating all his time to this. وإن حدث عن الأعراب والأنساب قلت لا يحسن إلا هذا. So basically he was an expert in hadith in its entirety. Ayyub Sakhtiyani rahimahullah said, ما رأيت أحدا أعلم من الزهري. So then someone asked him, ولا الحسن? So he said, ما رأيت أحدا أعلم من الزهري. And you know, Imam Zuhri rahimahullah, he was the main teacher of Imam Malik rahimahullah. Those of you who are doing the Muwatta, you know we spoke about him in the preludes and also under the first narration. So there are numerous quotations, and we quoted those praises of Imam Malik rahimahullah for him. So from this you can get an idea on what a great scholar he was, that mujtahids are acknowledging his expertise. So that's the first narrator. Who is he quoting from? He's quoting from Salim ibn Abdullah ibn Umar. We also spoke about him in the Asanid when we were discussing the Rijal of the Muwatta. So he was one of the 7 fuqaha of Medina, and he was also a great muhaddith. Alama ibn Sa'ada rahimahullah, he said, وَكَانَ ثِقَةً كَثِيرَ الْحَدِيثِ عَالِيًا مِنَ الرِّجَالِ وَرَعًا. You can see that when he's praising his expertise in hadith, he made sure that he's wara'an, that he was also very pious. And there's a great lesson. I don't want to digress, but it's a great lesson for us. What ilm we should also become pious. Alama Dhahabi rahimahullah, he also describes him like this here. He says, Al-Imam al-Zahid, Al-Hafiz, Mufti al-Madina. And he quotes from Ahmad ibn Abdullah al-Ijli rahimahullah that he said, Salim ibn Abdullah tabi'iyun thiqatun. So that's the second narrator. And then the third narrator is the Sahabi Abdullah ibn Umar. Since he was a Sahabi, there is no need to discuss about his greatness. Alama Qasim ibn Qutlubgha rahimullah, he mentioned that we do not have to consider these conditions for the Sahaba. وَلَمْ يَعْتَبِرُوهُ فِي الصَّحَابَةِ. The Sahaba, you put them all in one category. So whether they're from the Sabiqun al-Awwalun, or whether they're from the Badriyun, whether they're the Ashara Mubashara, whether they accepted Islam later, you can put them all into one category. And that is how you all see also. We mentioned that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, his name does not feature. But nevertheless, Abdullah ibn Umar, it's sufficient to say that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam made tawthiq for him. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam authenticated him. In Sahih Muslim, you know, the narration come, فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أرى عبد الله رجلا صالحا. Can you imagine that? I think that Abdullah is a pious person. He was such that even if he was not from amongst the Sahaba, he possessed such qualities that it would make him deserving of Jannah. So Sa'id ibn al-Musayyab, and this here comes in Mustadrak, volume 3, page 559, he said, لو شهدت على أحد أنه من أهل الجنة لشهدت على ابن عمر. If I had to bear testimony that anyone is from the people of Jannah, then I would have given this testimony for Ibn Umar. Now, Ibn Umar was a Sahabi, so you can give this testimony for any Sahabi. But the reason why the meaning of the statement here is that if Ibn Umar was not a Sahabi, and then I had to take an oath and say that this person is definitely from Jannah, then my oath would have been valid. So this here is the first sanad from this highest group that Hafiz ibn Hajar rahimahullah described as Asahul Asanid. And like we said, that this here is the opinion of Imam Ishaq and Imam Ahmad rahimahullah.